Hi everyone, this is the Прошлое channel and project The Frontiers of Historical Research. My name is Mikhail Rodin. Today we will study how geography and landscapes influence the genetics of human populations.
How is human genetics related to geography and landscape?
Human is one of large mammal species. So in general, in population genetics, there is some idea called isolation by distance. And it's, not surprising that humans which live more distant apart are genetically less similar than those ones which live nearby, so which live in the same geographic region, and so on and so forth. However, this dependence is not completely smooth. I would say that they are in a modern, human population. They are big hubs, big melting pots, which are cities, where people from different areas, from mountains and the other places are are migrating, and then they admix and produce more or less panmictic population. However, in remote areas like high mountains, like dense forests, or other areas difficult to reach, humans maintain their genetic structure, their gene pool more or less unchangeable or with very little changes since very old time. In many cases since the time where our ancestors were hunters and gatherers. And the recent genetic studies actually confirmed this. In historical tradition, actually, especially in European historical tradition which comes since 18th century, there is a widespread idea about replacing of some populations with the others in a historical period, like a big migration of humans, like migration of people from Central Asia and populating Asia Minor currently, or migration of German tribes to Britain and replacing local Brits, local Celts. But actually genetic studies which have been developed since last 20-30 years show that these ideas must be substantially corrected. I would say a very simple example. Turks, which consider themselves and people around consider them as offspring of people which migrated somewhere from Central Asia some times ago. Current genetic studies say that just maybe 7% of genes, 7% of alleles they have, are coming from this area. And vast majority of the population and vast majority of their genes are from local Asia Minor population which lived there since a while. Similar stuff is shown for like Britain. It was a popular idea that they are like Celts, Scottish or Welsh or Irish and Cornish people, and they are English, which exterminated Celts from the rest of the British island and populated it. But what we know now that about 15 to 17% of alleles of a modern Englishman are actually coming from continental Europe, from German populated areas, and the rest is coming from the old living people in this place. So it is a quite interesting stuff. I would just summarize this very briefly that languages and religions, of course, and identity and some elements of cultures have rates of expansion which is much higher than rate of expansions of humans themselves. So that's a general idea.
How many genetically related human populations existed in the Upper Paleolithic? And how was their distribution related to the glacier and ecological zones of that period?
You know that we live now in Pleistocene glacial period. And Pleistocene glaciation, it's something what started about 2.5 million of years ago. And actually it is a periodic glaciation of the Earth, large glaciation of the Earth, like glacial waves, which are about once 100 years, which are replaced with a relatively short interglacials, 20,000 years long. And our most important ancestors, I say most important ancestors because now everybody knows that every of us has some portion of alleles which are coming from Neanderthals, from an older population of Eurasia, migrated from Africa. Well, this migration started about 70,000 of years ago and generally ended, not completely of course, like 45,000 of years ago. And then it came a glacial maximum. And people which had sufficient time to disperse throughout the Eurasia appeared to be captured in a more or less isolated refugial areas in different parts of the continent, in Eastern Asia, in Southern Asia, in Europe, and in the Western Asia as well, in the Middle East. Also, it is important that within each of these major isolation places, there were maybe to less extent isolated fragments of the landscape appropriate for human living. It was mostly a savanna-like landscape, like high grasslands with rare trees, and which were the most appropriate, which were the places where our ancestors could gain their food, could hunt on big hoofs, big ungulates, and actually they maintained, these populations maintained more or less isolated from each other for about 20 to 30,000 of years, because last interglacial, which we know as a Holocene, where all our civilization and culture has been developed. Yes, and during that time, some genetic differences arose between the people from different areas. After that, actually, they admixed, and what we see now that in the areas which summary distance to all these refugees is the smallest, there is a highest genetic diversity of people. Directly speaking, somewhere in Central Asia. Actually, the humans there, people there are most diverse genetically. And when we move towards the Pacific and towards the Atlantic Ocean, this diversity is declining gradually. However, for instance, in Georgia, you can find like a Y chromosome haplogroups. You know what is Y chromosome haplogroups? Those are genes which are inherited directly from the father to the son. And well, therefore, they don't recombine. And of course, they don't describe the entire genetic diversity of genetic pool of the population, but there are some interesting markers. And now in an individual family in Georgia, you can find people with haplogroups like G and J, which have been diverged some 30,000 of years ago. And supposedly one of those arises somewhere in the southern Caucasus or northern Iran, and another one south of the big like uplands which come from southern Georgia towards the Lake Van. And of course, they easily admixed after the glaciation has stopped. The same, I believe, is in Eastern Europe, in Russia or Ukraine. I believe you can find people with a very different haplogroups just in the same family.
When and where did the first settlement of the Caucasus occur? How many of these initial genetic waves were there? How do we know about them?
They are increasing. There is an increasing number of genomic studies about population of Europe in early Neolithics or Mesolithics or late Paleolithic. And as a result, we sufficiently well know how the Europe has been populated. With the Caucasus is a little bit more complicated. There were very interesting studies run by several research groups, research group of Balanovsky in Russia and Vanonasidze in Germany. Unfortunately, these studies were when genomic methods were not so widespread. Recently, in our university, in Ilia State University, we conducted a study of 600,000 genetic markers of people from different regions of Georgia, from the northern Caucasus and Armenia, and some parts of Turkey. And it appears that there were three most important sources of migration in early post-glacial period in this area. And the one was just associated somewhere with Colchis, with the area east of the Black Sea. You know that there were findings of hunter-gatherers remains in western Georgia caves. But they are also, there is also another source of migrants, which is from a southern part of Asia Minor. And they are findings of hunter-gatherers from Asia Minor. So this is about 12 to 13,000 of years ago, before the first agricultural, settlements. And they are also, there is also a certain proportion of European hunter-gatherers, most of all from Balkan Peninsula. And currently this descent of these European hunter-gatherers are most widespread in Balkans and in Northern Europe, like Scandinavia. And some part of them obviously migrated through the northern coast of the Black Sea to the Caucasus and settled there. And what is even more interesting, that even you consider, you assume that the Caucasus is a relatively small geographic region. But however, in spite of this, in geographic structure within the Caucasus, you find differential traces of these three sources of migrants. Particularly alleles which are coming from old population of Colchis, hunters-gatherers of Colchis, are most commonly found in villages of Upper Imereti, Racha. So the villages are just close to these caves. So it was really very surprising. And it gradually declines towards the east and towards the west and towards the north from this area. So the structure, like in mountain western Georgia, is quite maintained since that time. Concerning Balkan population, you find a huge portion of alleles of Balkan population in the northern Caucasus among Chechens, among Balkars. Unfortunately, we didn't have Kabardinians in our sample, but also in Georgians actually living in the northern slope of the Greater Caucasus, so historical provinces of Khevsureti and Tusheti. And finally, as expected, also not surprising, the Anatolian genes are dominating in Armenians, but also in Mesks, so Georgian from southern Georgia, and in Laz, so Kartvelian-speaking people which are living currently in northeastern Turkey. Therefore, it's quite interesting that you still can find these traces of different sources of migration in different parts of the region. And well, it is also another and very surprising and very strange source of migration, which is Eastern Siberia. And those are findings from Eastern Siberia, remainders exceeding 25,000 of years. So they are very old, and you clearly find a pattern. You find the traces of the alleles of the Siberian people in the northern Caucasus and in Georgia. Not in Armenia, not in Mesks, and not in like current population from Turkey. So those are very interesting people because they were strange wanderers. In spite of glacial period, they most likely moved throughout the entire Siberia and Eurasian steppe just during the peak of glacial period. And somehow they managed to expand somewhere, everywhere, almost everywhere. I think that their traces are also very important for the current European population.
When did the main modern Eurasian populations form, and why did their mixing practically cease in the Neolithic period?
Yes, this is an interesting question. Even, like 30 years ago, there was an interesting publication of Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, just one of the most important people in human population genetics, maybe founder of the modern human population genetics. It was based yet not on DNA markers, but on allozyme analysis. And he showed that whereas in Eurasia there is a clear pattern of isolation by distance, such pattern absence, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa. And what we can judge from this, isolation by distance normally is observed when the population is established long enough and, well, they already spread and they started to develop their genetic differences as a result of gene drift and selection and other processes to a certain threshold level, which is dependent on the migration rates. So higher migration, of course, more similar are gene pools of the two populations. And it appears that more or less finally, the genetic structure of the most of Eurasia has been established somewhere in early agricultural periods, so like in Neolithics and so on. And most likely, we can now only hypothesize about this, but most likely it is just related with the carrying capacity. So the human population, which was little before that, because they were dependent on natural resources, which are limited, started to increase because humans managed to increase the resources they need for food and for shelter. And as a result, somehow the areas most appropriate for living were saturated, more or less saturated. Not to the level that they became like a strongholds and don't allowing other outsiders to come in, but to a level that the migration of outsiders became more or less limited. And the rural population, I underline rural population, more or less stabilized on this level. However, here one must remember that the level of not stability, but maintenance, or I don't know, the stagnancy maybe of a population genetic pool strongly would depend on the mode of life. Like in high mountains, as I told, in remote places, it remains almost unchanged since hunter-gatherer period. It is not so in a lowland, densely populated agricultural lands, where some migrations continued and still continue to occur. And finally, cities, you know, they are open for migration and they restructure the entire population, but they don't really strongly affect these remote rural areas because migration between cities and rural areas is strongly asymmetric. So people mostly move to cities and not from cities. There are some exceptions, but they are exceptions.
What does the modern genetic map of the Caucasus look like, and how is it related to the landscape?
Yes, it is interesting stuff. It's one of the early our studies, and I am myself a little bit critical now to this research. But it appeared that certain genetic markers obviously are associated with a certain type of landscape. In particular, so the areas which are covered with forest and which are like dominating in the Western Caucasus, they are largely populated with humans, on the one hand with a certain Y chromosome markers, but also, as a genomic study showed, they stronger depend on ancient Colchic hunter-gatherers. So if you go from the western to eastern Georgia, of course, it is now more or less Panmictic population, but however, the traces of like Anatolian influence and to some extent also Balkan influence in eastern Georgia is now just more obvious than in like western Georgia. So it is likely that people from more open areas, more areas, well, appropriate for intensive agriculture, from Anatolia, most likely they were moving first of all in the similar areas in the Caucasus, so in the southern Caucasus and in the east of it. Also, the western Caucasus seemingly is geographically closer to these Anatolian areas. So it's like, and well, I believe that you will find everywhere a sort of this diversifying pattern. But in the Caucasus is interesting because it is a very mosaic landscape. It has mountains, it has important natural barriers for migration of early humans, and therefore you can make a lot of observations here, yeah, which is difficult to make maybe in many other parts of the world.
Can we say that we know everything about this genetic map, or do we need more research?
Well, we know more or less nothing, but yes, we know something, I would say. We know something. It is, for instance, it was the, I think, Balanovsky's group studies, which first established the gradient of genetic markers going from the west to the east of the northern Caucasus. What we found that similar gradient, but not so expressed, is in the southern Caucasus, in Georgia. It is interesting that Armenians we studied, yes, it is, they obviously they keep some like Y chromosome markers, which are associated with like Indo-European migrations already, and you know that Armenian language, different from Georgian or North Caucasian language, belongs to the Indo-European family, so one of the early branches of Indo-European family. But however, those markers bear maybe like less than 30% of the modern Armenian population. So, and genomic studies clearly show that they are genetically related to the ancient population of Anatolia. It's like something like this. Another interesting question is about like Ossetians, no? Which also speak Indo-European language, and which actually their identity is related to Alans and, Sarmatians and people which lived in the western part of Eurasian steppe. However, genetics shows that this is also an ancient population of the central Caucasus which just lived there, which ancestors lived there since a while. That's what can I say about this.